Look at the rust.
It's pretty bad here.
The chrome bumper caught the sunlight first. Just a glint, really, breaking through the murky water like a wink from the past. Then the roof. Then the whole car, a 1984 Chevrolet Impala, emerging from the mud of Lake Overhalser as the drought pulled back the water like a curtain on a stage nobody wanted to see. October 2024. The worst dry spell Oklahoma had experienced in 60 years. And there, on the dashboard, perfectly aligned as if arranged by a jeweler's hand, sat two gold wedding bands, side by side, deliberate. The windows were rolled up tight. The seatbelts were still fastened around what remained of two people who had been wearing wedding clothes 39 years earlier. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. Two brothers, Travis and Mark Gillespie, were fishing with a new fish finder they'd bought at a Bass Pro Shop clearance sale. The sonar pinged something large and geometric where nothing should be. They called it in. By Wednesday afternoon, a crane was pulling the Impala from what used to be 20 feet of water. By Thursday, the story was national news. Not because of the bodies turned up in lakes all the time, but because of those rings, because of what they suggested, because of the questions they raised in a way that bones alone never could. The car came up slowly, water streaming from the wheel wells like piers. The crowd that gathered, reporters, curiosity seekers, retired locals with nothing better to do, fell silent as the vehicle broke the surface. There was something obscene about it, something that felt like a violation, as if they were excavating not just a car, but a sealed moment, a decision that was meant to stay buried forever. Detective Sarah Clarkson arrived at the scene with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. She was 38, with her father's wristwatch on her left arm and a habit of clicking her pen 3 times before writing anything important. Cold cases were her specialty. The dead didn't lie, didn't lawyer up, didn't change their stories. They just waited. She had pulled the missing persons report that morning. Roy and Linda Kane, married July 14, 1985. Last seen leaving the First Baptist Church in El Reno in a car decorated with tin cans and white ribbon. 25 and 23 years old. Their families had spent 4 decades believing they'd been victims of Route 66, that notorious stretch of American highway that had claimed its share of drifters, runaways, and the occasional young couple in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this wasn't that. Sarah Clarkson could tell that much just from looking at the placement of those rings. She'd seen enough crime scenes to know the difference between chaos and intention. Chaos scattered things. Intention arranged them. Someone had placed those rings there, carefully, with purpose. The question was whether it had been Roy or Linda, or both of them together, in some final shared gesture, and why. The forensics team worked methodically. They always did. Photographs from every angle, measurements, documentation of every detail before anything was moved. The car's interior was a time capsule of 1985. Cassette tapes in the glove box, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Journey, an air freshener in the shape of a pine tree that had long since lost any scent, and in the back seat, 2 suitcases, unopened, still packed with clothes for a honeymoon that never happened. The medical examiner was a woman named Patricia Reeves, who had a reputation for being able to read bones the way other people read newspapers. She spent 40 minutes examining the remains before she spoke to anyone. When she finally emerged from the tent they'd set up, she pulled off her gloves with the kind of slow deliberation that meant she'd found something that troubled her. She told Sarah Clarkson that there were no signs of trauma, no fractures consistent with a struggle, no defensive wounds. The bones showed nothing but the passage of time and the patience of water. Both victims had been wearing seatbelts when they died. Both had remained in their seats as the car filled. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the on position. Not ACC, not off, on, as if someone had wanted the engine running when the water came in. Sarah clicked her pen 3 times and wrote that down. The families were contacted that same evening. Roy Kane's sister, Diane, was 67 now and living in Tulsa. She'd been 18 when her brother disappeared. She told Sarah over the phone that she'd always known something was wrong about the disappearance. Roy wasn't the type to just vanish. He was responsible, steady. He'd worked construction since he was 16 and saved every penny for the wedding. He'd been so excited about marrying Linda that he talked about nothing else for months. The idea that he'd driven off into the sunset and abandoned everyone who loved him had never made sense, but neither had any other explanation. Until now. Linda's mother had passed away in 2003, still believing her daughter would walk through the door one day with some improbable story of amnesia or abduction. Her father, Walter Barrows, was 91 and in a care facility in Oklahoma City. When Sarah called to inform him, there was a long silence on the line. Then a sound like air leaving a tire. Then nothing else. The nurse who took the phone said Mr. Barrows would need time. Everyone would need time. 39 years hadn't been enough. Sarah returned to the scene the next morning. The Impala had been transported to the state forensics garage, but she wanted to see the lake again in daylight, wanted to understand the geography. Lake Overholser sat just west of Oklahoma City, fed by the North Canadian River. In 1985, it had been a popular spot for fishing and weekend picnics. The drought had exposed more than just the car. The old shoreline was visible now, marked by a band of sun-bleached debris and dead vegetation. From where she stood, Sarah could see the trajectory. There was a dirt access road that led down to what used to be the water's edge. Not a main road, not somewhere you'd end up by accident, somewhere you'd have to choose. The tire tracks were still there, faintly, preserved in the hardened mud. Forensics had already photographed and cast them. They showed acceleration, no braking, a straight line from the road to the water. Physics and intention in parallel tracks. But it was the glove compartment that changed everything. The forensics team opened it that afternoon in the sterile brightness of the garage. Inside was a waterproof envelope, the kind used by boaters to protect documents. It had held. The paper inside was damp but readable. $3,000 in cash, 1985 denominations, 20s and 50s, still bound with a paper band from First National Bank of El Reno. And beneath the cash, a receipt, handwritten, dated July 14, 1985, 6 a.m., 6 hours before the wedding ceremony. Partial payment on account, Dennis Holmgren Auto and Loan, $3,000 received, balance outstanding, $12,000. Dennis Holmgren. The name appeared in the original missing persons file. He'd been interviewed in 1985 as part of the standard canvassing of anyone who'd had recent contact with Roy and Linda Kane. He'd told investigators he'd loaned the couple money for car repairs and wedding expenses. He'd said they were good kids who'd gotten in over their heads. He'd said he hoped they were okay. He'd said a lot of things, apparently. But he hadn't mentioned a $3,000 payment made the morning of their disappearance. Sarah clicked her pen 3 times. Dennis Holmgren was still alive, 80 years old now, living in a small ranch house on the outskirts of El Reno. Sarah drove out to see him on a Friday afternoon. The house was tidy in the way that lonely houses often are. Everything in its place, no clutter, no mess, no evidence of a life being actively lived. Holmgren answered the door with a toothpick between his teeth and a tremor in his left hand that made his fingers dance independently of his intentions. He recognized Sarah's badge before she could introduce herself. He invited her in without being asked, made coffee without asking if she wanted any. Sat down at a kitchen table that looked like it had been scrubbed clean that morning, and waited. Sarah showed him the receipt, watched his face, watched his eyes, watched the way the toothpick shifted from one side of his mouth to the other, like a metronome counting seconds. His hands never stopped shaking. But then, they probably hadn't stopped shaking in 40 years. He told her about the loan. He'd owned an auto repair shop back then, did some side lending to folks who couldn't get bank approval. Roy Kane had needed $8,000 for a rebuilt transmission and another $7,000 for the wedding expenses. $15,000 total. A fortune for a young construction worker in 1985. Holmgren had agreed because Roy seemed honest, and Linda's father had vouched for them. The terms were informal. Pay it back when you can. Interest negotiable. The kind of arrangement that didn't involve lawyers or paperwork or anything enforceable. But Roy had come to him the morning of the wedding with $3,000 in cash, said it was all he had, said he needed more time for the rest. Holmgren told Sarah he'd taken the money and told Roy to forget about the rest, written it off. He'd felt sorry for them, young love drowning in debt. It seemed cruel to add to their burden on their wedding day. Sarah asked him why he hadn't mentioned this in 1985. Holmgren's tremor got worse. The toothpick snapped between his teeth. He said he'd been scared. Scared of looking like he had something to do with their disappearance. Scared of being connected to something he didn't understand. He'd figured if they'd run off somewhere, the money didn't matter. If something bad had happened, the money didn't matter either. So he'd kept quiet. It was the wrong choice, he knew that now. But at the time, it had seemed simpler. Sarah believed him. Years of interrogations had taught her to recognize the difference between deception and regret. Holmgren was drowning in regret. But there was something else too, something he kept glancing at, a photo on the wall behind Sarah's shoulder. She turned to look. It was a wedding photo. Holmgren and a woman with dark hair, both young, both smiling. 1970s by the look of the clothes. She died, he said, before Sarah could ask. Cancer, 1992. They'd never had kids. He'd never remarried. The shop closed in 2006. Since then, he'd been alone with his memories, and his tremor, and his toothpicks. He asked Sarah if she thought Roy and Linda had suffered. She told him she didn't know. She told him she'd let him know when she did. Back at the station, Sarah spread the case file across her desk. 39 years of paper, missing persons reports, search records, interviews with family, friends, acquaintances, theories, dead ends. The file had been officially closed in 1992 when the leads ran out and the family stopped calling. Now it was open again, resurrected by drought and time and 2 gold rings that refused to be forgotten. The original investigation had focused on the possibility of foul play. Route 66 was notorious in the 80s. Hitchhikers disappeared, young couples stopped at the wrong gas station and were never seen again. There were rumors of organized crime, of drug runners, of predators who hunted along the highway looking for easy targets. The Canes fit the profile. Young, trusting, driving an older car that wouldn't have been hard to force off the road. The working theory had been abduction or robbery gone wrong. But there had never been any evidence. No witnesses, no ransom demands, no bodies. Until now. And now the evidence told a different story. Not abduction, not robbery, something else, something deliberate. Something that involved taking off wedding rings and placing them carefully on a dashboard before driving into a lake at dawn. Something that involved $3,000 in cash tucked into a glove compartment. Something that involved a trajectory without brake marks. Sarah clicked her pen 3 times and circled a name in the file. Walter Barrows, Linda's father. In 1985, he'd been interviewed extensively. He'd told investigators his daughter was happy, that Roy was a good man, that the wedding had been beautiful, that he couldn't imagine why they'd disappeared. But there was a note in the margin, written in the cramped handwriting of the original detective. Father defensive about wedding costs, avoided direct questions about finances. Sarah looked at the clock. 4:30 p.m. Visiting hours at Restwood Care Center ended at 6. She grabbed her keys and her cold coffee and headed for the door. Sometimes the answers weren't in the evidence. Sometimes they were in the things people didn't say. But there was one more thing, one detail that nobody had paid attention to in 1985 because nobody had thought to look for it. The wedding had been expensive, extraordinarily expensive. Cathedral rental, catered reception, live band, flowers, photography, cake. For a construction worker and a department store clerk, it should have been impossible. The numbers didn't add up then, and they still didn't add up now. Someone had paid for that wedding, and Sarah was starting to suspect she knew who. Walter Barrows didn't look like a man who carried secrets. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by time and left to dry in the sun. 91 years old, thin as a winter branch, sitting in a wheelchair by the window of his room at Restwood Care Center. The kind of room that tried very hard to not look institutional and failed. Beige walls, floral curtains, a television playing a game show with the sound turned down.
And everywhere, the smell of antiseptic trying to mask something older and more inevitable. Sarah Clarkson introduced herself, showed her badge, asked if Mr. Barrows remembered her phone call from earlier in the week. He did. His memory was sharp, the nurse had warned her. Too sharp, maybe. Some people were lucky enough to forget their pain as they aged. Walter Barrows wasn't one of them. He asked if she'd found out how his daughter died. Sarah told him the medical examiner was still working on the final report, but there were no signs of violence, no indication anyone had hurt them. Walter nodded slowly, his hands folded in his lap. Clean hands, manicured nails. Even at 91, even in a care facility, he maintained certain standards. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, despite the fact he rarely walked anywhere. Old habits, Sarah thought, the kind that outlive their purpose. She asked him about the wedding, about the costs.
About how a young couple with modest incomes had managed to afford what the invoices suggested was a $15,000 celebration. Walter's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. He told her he'd helped. Any father would. It was his only daughter, his only child. He'd wanted her to have a proper wedding, something the town would remember, something that reflected well on the family. Sarah asked how much he'd contributed. Walter looked out the window. The view was of a parking lot and a struggling oak tree. He was quiet for long enough that Sarah thought he might not answer. Then he said, all of it. He'd paid for all of it. Every flower, every piece of cake, every note of music. $15,000 he'd saved over 20 years of running a dry goods store in El Reno. His retirement fund, his security, gone in a single day. She asked why. He told her because his business had failed. Because everyone in town knew it had failed. Because he'd made bad investments and worse decisions, and by 1985, the store was 3 months from foreclosure. But nobody knew that yet. And the wedding was his chance to show the town that Walter Barrows was still someone, still respectable, still capable of throwing the kind of celebration that people talked about for years. Sarah clicked her pen 3 times. She asked if Roy and Linda had known about his financial situation. Walter's hands tightened in his lap. His knuckles went white. He said they'd found out the week before the wedding. He'd had to tell them because he'd needed them to take over some of the vendor payments. Small things. The photographer, the florist, a few hundred here, 1,000 there. He told them it was temporary, told them he'd pay them back, told them not to worry. But they had worried. Of course they had. They were 25 and 23 years old and suddenly responsible for debts they'd never agreed to take on. Roy had tried to cancel some of the bookings, tried to scale things back, but Walter had insisted, had told them it was too late. The deposits were non-refundable. The invitations were sent. People were expecting something. The Barrows family reputation was on the line. Sarah asked what happened after the wedding. Walter's eyes filled with tears, but none fell. He said he didn't know. They'd left the reception early, said they wanted to start driving to their honeymoon destination before dark. He'd hugged Linda, told her he was proud of her, told her everything would work out. And then they were gone. And then they were just gone forever. The store closed 4 months later. Walter declared bankruptcy, moved to Oklahoma City, worked odd jobs until he couldn't work anymore, spent 40 years wondering if his daughter had run away because of him, because of the debt he'd saddled her with, because he'd been more concerned with appearances than with her happiness. He'd wanted to give her the perfect day. Instead, he'd given her a reason to vanish. Sarah asked if he'd ever considered that they might not have run away, that something else might have happened. Walter looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were pale blue and sharp as broken glass. He said of course he'd considered it. Every single day for 39 years. But considering it didn't change anything, didn't bring her back, didn't explain why there had never been any trace of them until a drought dried up a lake and exposed what he'd spent 4 decades trying not to imagine. She thanked him for his time, left her card, walked back to her car through the parking lot with its struggling oak tree and its asphalt that radiated heat like a rebuke. Walter Barrows wasn't a killer, but he built the cage his daughter had trying to escape. Back at the station, Sarah pulled the financial records she'd subpoenaed from the bank.
It had taken a week to get them, the records being nearly 40 years old and stored in offsite archives. But they told a story that matched Walter's confession. $15,000 withdrawn from his savings account in increments between January and July 1985. Every cent he'd accumulated over 2 decades. Gone. And there was something else. Roy Kane's bank records. He'd deposited exactly $3,000 in cash on July 13th, the day before the wedding, withdrawn it on the morning of July 14th at 6 a.m. from an ATM in El Reno, taken it to Dennis Holmgren, made a partial payment on a debt that Holmgren had forgiven anyway, then got married, then disappeared. The timeline was taking shape, but it still didn't explain the car in the lake, didn't explain the rings on the dashboard, didn't explain why 2 young people would drive their packed honeymoon suitcases to a lake and never leave. Sarah needed more context. She needed to understand who Roy and Linda had been beyond the wedding photos and the missing persons report. She started making calls, found Roy's former co-workers from the construction company, found Linda's friends from the department store where she'd worked, found their neighbors from the apartment they'd rented on Maple Street. The picture that emerged was consistent. Roy and Linda had been ordinary, unremarkable in the best possible way. They worked hard, paid their bills on time, didn't cause trouble, didn't make waves. Linda had a habit of twirling her hair around her finger when she was nervous. Roy had a tell when he was worried, tapping his right foot in a rhythm only he could hear. They'd been together since high school. Everyone who knew them said they were devoted to each other, inseparable, the kind of couple that finished each other's sentences. But there was something else too, something that multiple people mentioned independently.
In the weeks leading up to the wedding, both Roy and Linda had seemed stressed, distracted. Linda had called in sick to work 3 times in June. Roy had shown up to a job site late twice, which was unlike him. When people asked if everything was okay, they'd smiled and said wedding planning was overwhelming, but the smiles hadn't quite reached their eyes. One of Linda's co-workers, a woman named Janet Priestley, who is now 68 and retired in Tulsa, remembered a conversation from early July. Linda had been on her break, sitting in the employee lounge, staring at her sandwich like it was a problem she couldn't solve. Janet had asked if she was getting cold feet. Linda had laughed. A strange laugh, Janet said, hollow. And then Linda had said something that stuck with Janet for nearly 40 years. She'd said, "Sometimes I think it would be easier if we just disappeared. Started over somewhere nobody knows us. No expectations, no debts, just us."
Janet had thought it was just pre-wedding jitters. Everyone got them. But now, talking to Detective Clarkson on the phone, she wondered if it had meant something more. Sarah thanked her and hung up, clicked her pen 3 times, wrote "disappear" in her notebook, and underlined it twice. The case was starting to feel less like a mystery and more like a tragedy, but there were still pieces missing, still questions that didn't have answers. And then the call came from an unexpected source. Her name was Brenda Tyndall, 62 years old, calling from Amarillo, Texas. She'd seen the news coverage of the tar being pulled from Lake Overholser, seen the names Roy and Linda Kane, and remembered something her mother had told her years ago, something she'd forgotten until the story brought it back. Her mother had been Marjorie Tyndall. She'd worked as a waitress at the Route 66 diner in El Reno from 1978 until she retired in 2002. She'd passed away in 2019, but Marjorie had been a pack rat, saved everything, receipts, newspaper clippings, and most strangely, napkins. Hundreds of napkins from the diner with notes written on them, customer orders, bits of overheard conversation, little observations that had caught her attention. Marjorie had kept them all in shoe boxes in her closet. When Brenda had cleaned out her mother's house after she died, she'd found the boxes, almost thrown them away, but something had stopped her. Sentiment, maybe. The sense that these scraps of paper were the closest thing to a diary her mother had ever kept. So she'd packed them up and stored them in her own attic. Hadn't looked at them since. Until now. Brenda told Sarah she'd gone through the boxes that weekend, looked for any napkins dated July 1985, and found one. Table 4, morning of July 14th. And on it, in her mother's crammed handwriting, a note that made Sarah's blood go cold. Sarah drove to Amarillo. 6 hours through flat Texas landscape with nothing but her cold coffee and her thoughts for company. Brenda Tyndall lived in a modest house on the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it had been built in the 50s and hadn't changed much since. She answered the door holding a shoebox and an expression Sarah had seen before, the look of someone who knows they're carrying a piece of someone else's tragedy and isn't sure what to do with it. They sat at the kitchen table. Brenda opened the box. Inside were dozens of napkins, yellowed with age, covered in writing. She pulled one from the stack. It was thinner than the others, torn at one corner. The date in the upper right corner, 7/14/85. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Table 4, early morning. Young couple, just married by the look of them. Girl wearing white dress, pearl earring in left ear only. Boy in suit, cowboy boots, nervous. Girl crying, he holding her hand. She said, "Dad will never forgive us this debt. We'd be better off not existing." He said, "Then we'll leave beautifully." Paid in cash, left big tip. Seemed final. Sarah read it 3 times, asked if she could take it. Brenda said yes, said she hoped it helped, said she'd been carrying the weight of it all weekend. Some things weren't meant to be kept in attics. The drive back to Oklahoma City passed in a blur. Sarah's mind was racing through possibilities, implications, interpretations. Leave beautifully. What did that mean? Leave town? Leave their old lives behind? Or something more permanent? Something irreversible? She called the forensics garage from the road, asked them to go back over the car, check every compartment, every pocket, every seam. Look for anything they might have missed, anything personal, anything written. They called her back 3 hours later. They'd found something, tucked into the driver's side door pocket, sealed in a plastic Ziploc bag. The kind used for sandwiches. It had protected the contents from water damage for 39 years. Inside was a piece of paper, notebook paper, folded into quarters, written in blue ink. A letter. Sarah was still an hour from the city. She told them not to open it. Don't read it. Don't touch it more than necessary. She'd be there soon. She made it in 45 minutes. The letter was laid out on a sterile examination table under bright fluorescent lights. Sarah put on gloves, unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was feminine, rounded letters, careful script. The kind taught in schools before cursive fell out of fashion. It read, "Mom, Dad, Mr. and Mrs. Kane. We're so sorry. We can't live like this. The debt, the pressure, the expectations. We tried, we really did, but it's too much. Every day feels like drowning. So we're choosing to drown together, on our terms, while we're still happy, while we still love each other, before the weight of it all crushes what we have. We're leaving the rings for you. Sell them. Use the money to pay back what you can. We won't need them where we're going. We love you. We're sorry. This is not your fault. This is us choosing each other over everything else. L and R." The room was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Sarah read it again, then a third time, and with each reading, the case transformed. Not a mystery, not a murder, not even an accident. A choice, a decision made together, a pact. She thought about the rings on the dashboard, the careful placement, the seatbelts still fastened,
The keys in the ignition turned to on. The trajectory without brake marks. The packed suitcases they'd never unpacked. The $3,000 meant for a creditor who'd forgiven the debt anyway. All of it was part of a plan, a final plan, made by two people who couldn't see any other way out. But there was one more person Sarah needed to talk to.
Someone who'd been orbiting the case since the beginning, but hadn't been central to it. Someone who might have answers that nobody else could provide. Dennis Holmgren had told her he'd forgiven the debt, but she needed to understand the full context, needed to know what Roy and Linda had believed versus what was actually true. Because the difference between those two things was the difference between a tragedy and a preventable tragedy. She drove back to El Reno that evening, found Holmgren in his tidy house, with his tremor and his toothpicks and his loneliness. She showed him the letter, watched him read it, watched his face collapse in on itself like a building being demolished from within. He told her he tried to stop them. Not literally, he didn't know what they were planning. But the morning of the wedding, when Roy had come to him with the $3,000, Holmgren had told him to keep it, told him the debt was forgiven. All of it, not just the balance. Everything.
He'd seen how stressed Roy looked, how desperate. He'd remembered being young and in debt himself, remembered how it felt to believe that money problems were insurmountable. So he'd torn up the loan agreement right there in front of Roy, told him to go enjoy his wedding, enjoy his life. The money didn't matter. But Roy had insisted on leaving the $3,000 anyway, said it was the right thing to do, said he needed to pay something. Holmgren had tried to refuse, but Roy had already set the envelope down and walked out, left it on the counter. Holmgren had kept it, not knowing what else to do with it. And then Roy and Linda had disappeared, and the money had felt cursed. He'd put it in the bank, never touched it. It was still there, actually, sitting in an account he never used, growing interest for 39 years, waiting for someone to claim it. Sarah asked him why he hadn't told anyone this in 1985. Holmgren's tremor got worse. He said he'd been afraid. Afraid people would think he'd killed them over the money, afraid of being connected to their disappearance. So he'd kept quiet about the forgiven debt, kept quiet about Roy's desperation, kept quiet about everything, and the silence had felt like acid in his stomach for 4 decades. Sarah told him it wouldn't have changed anything. Even if he'd told investigators in 1985 that he'd forgiven the debt, Roy and Linda had already decided what they were going to do. They'd already written the letter, already planned their exit. Maybe they hadn't believed Holmgren. Maybe the debt was just one of many pressures. Maybe it had stopped being about the money and started being about something deeper. The weight of expectations, the fear of failure, the sense that their life together was starting under such impossible circumstances that it would never recover. Holmgren asked if they'd suffered. Sarah told him what the medical examiner had said. The car would have filled with water quickly. They would have lost consciousness within minutes. Together, holding hands, probably. In the vehicle they decorated with tin cans and hope, on the morning after what should have been the happiest day of their lives. He asked if he was responsible. Sarah told him no, but she wasn't sure if that was true. Responsibility in cases like this was diffuse, spread across many people. Walter Barrows and his pride, the creditors and their demands, the society that told young people they needed expensive weddings to prove their love, Dennis Holmgren and his well-meaning loan, and Roy and Linda themselves, who'd chosen this ending when other endings were possible, when help might have been available if they'd asked for it, when bankruptcy or elopement or a courthouse wedding or just running away to start over would have been better options than what they'd actually chosen. But Sarah didn't say any of that. She just thanked Holmgren for his honesty. Left him in his tidy house with his memories and his guilt. Drove back to the station as the sun set over Oklahoma in shades of orange and red that looked like the sky was bleeding. The case was essentially closed. Not officially, not yet. There would be paperwork, reports, final forensic confirmations. But the essential truth was clear. Roy and Linda Kane had died by their own hands, together, deliberately, on July 15, 1985, sometime around dawn. they'd driven to Lake Overholser, removed their wedding rings and placed them on the dashboard, sealed their suicide note in a plastic bag and tucked it into the door pocket, accelerated down the access road, crashed through the low barrier, entered the water at speed, and stayed there for 39 years while their families searched and wondered and grieved and eventually gave up hoping. But there was still one thing Sarah needed to do. One person who deserved to know the truth before it became public record. Before the news cycle picked it up and turned it into content. Before the tragedy became a headline. She went back to Restwood Care Center, found Walter Barrows in his room by the window, sat down across from him and told him everything. Showed him the letter. Watched him read his daughter's final words. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, held it against his chest, and said 5 words that Sarah would remember for the rest of her career. I gave her no choice. Sarah started to object, started to tell him that Roy and Linda had made their own decision, that many factors had contributed, that blame was complicated in situations like this. But Walter held up one trembling hand, stopped her. He didn't want comfort, didn't want absolution. He wanted to sit with the truth, the plain, terrible truth. That his pride had cost him his daughter, that his need to impress a town that didn't care had pushed 2 young people into a lake.
That the perfect wedding he'd insisted on had been the last thing they'd experienced before choosing death over the life it had saddled them with. Sarah left him there, sitting by the window with the letter pressed to his heart, looking out at the parking lot and the struggling oak tree, carrying the weight of knowledge that some people spend their whole lives trying to avoid, and others spend their whole lives waiting to finally receive. The official report took 2 weeks to finalize. Patricia Reeves, the medical examiner, documented everything with the kind of clinical precision that made tragedy sound like mathematics. Cause of death? Drowning. Manner of death? Suicide. 2 individuals. No signs of coercion. No evidence of third-party involvement. The bones told their story without embellishment. The water had preserved what it could and dissolved the rest. What remained was enough. But Sarah Clarkson couldn't let it go. Not yet.
There was something about the case that felt incomplete. Not the facts, those were clear enough, but the understanding, the why beneath the why. She'd read the suicide note a dozen times. Every day feels like drowning. Before the weight of it all crushes what we have, choosing each other over everything else. The words were there, but the full truth still felt just out of reach. She went back to the evidence, started from the beginning, the way she'd always did when something nagged at her. The rings on the dashboard. That image had been burned into her mind from the moment she'd first seen them. 2 gold bands, placed side by side with care. Not thrown, not dropped, not tangled with the gear shift or fallen into the cup holder. Placed, deliberately. A final act of symbolism from 2 people who'd wanted their last gesture to mean something. Sarah thought about the psychology of it, the ritual. Taking off your wedding ring hours after putting it on. The physical act of removal. The weight of gold leaving your finger. The pale band of skin underneath, unmarked, as if the marriage had never happened. And then the choice to leave them visible, not hidden in a pocket, not tucked away, on display, for whoever might eventually find them. It was a message, that much was clear. But to whom? Their families? The world? Each other? Or maybe just to themselves? Proof that they'd made this choice consciously, that even in their final moments, they'd been thinking clearly enough to perform this small ceremony, this unbinding. There was something almost theatrical about it, which made Sarah think about the rest of their plan. The timing, the location, the method. They'd chosen the morning after their wedding, the day they should have been starting their honeymoon, should have been waking up in some roadside motel full of optimism and exhaustion and newlywed awkwardness. Instead, they'd woken up, if they'd slept at all, and decided it was time. Sarah pulled the timeline. The wedding reception had ended around 11 p.m. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing Roy and Linda leave. They'd said their goodbyes, hugged family members, promised to call when they reached their destination. Classic departure. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested what was coming. But where had they gone after that? The diner where Marjorie Tyndall had seen them was a 24-hour place on Route 66, about 15 miles from the church. They'd been there early morning, Marjorie's napkin had said. Before dawn, probably. Which meant they'd spent the night somewhere between leaving the reception and ordering breakfast at table 4. Sarah made calls, checked motel registries from July 1985, found nothing under Kane. Checked variations. Roy's full name was Roy Daniel Kane. Linda's maiden name had been Barrows. Nothing. They'd either paid cash and used fake names, or they'd never checked into a motel at all. So where had they been? In the car, maybe.
Parked somewhere, talking, making their decision, writing their note. Roy would have done most of the writing, probably. The note had been in feminine handwriting, but couples often did that. The woman's script was usually neater, easier to read. But the words would have been composed together, each sentence a negotiation, each paragraph a shared commitment to the irreversible. Sarah imagined them sitting in that Impala, engine off, windows down to let in the July night air. Somewhere quiet, somewhere they wouldn't be disturbed. Maybe a rest stop, maybe a scenic overlook, maybe just a dirt road leading nowhere. And they talked through their options, listed their debts, calculated their futures, done the math that had told them there was no sustainable path forward, not one that preserved what they had together, not one that didn't involve decades of grinding poverty and resentment, and the slow erosion of whatever love had brought them to God Church in the first place.
And somewhere in that conversation, they'd decided, together, to end it together, while they were still happy, while the memory of the wedding was still fresh, while they could still look at each other and see hope instead of obligation. It was rational, in a terrible way, a cost-benefit analysis that had concluded life wasn't worth the cost. Sarah had seen it before in other cases. Financial stress was one of the leading factors in suicide. Add relationship pressure, family expectations, and the vulnerability of youth, and it became almost predictable. Not inevitable, never inevitable, but predictable enough that prevention programs existed. Crisis hotlines, financial counseling, bankruptcy protection, all of which might have helped if Roy and Linda had believed help was possible. But they hadn't. Or they had and decided it wasn't enough. Or they'd simply chosen this ending because it felt like theirs, like the one thing in their life they could control absolutely. The when and how and with whom. Sarah clicked her pen 3 times, looked at her notes, looked at the photos spread across her desk, the car emerging from the water, the rings on the dashboard, the suitcases in the back seat, the letter sealed in plastic, all the pieces of a tragedy that had been waiting 39 years to be understood. And then she saw it, the thing that had been bothering her, the detail that didn't quite fit, the suitcases. They'd packed for their honeymoon, filled 2 suitcases with clothes and toiletries and whatever else newlyweds thought they'd need for a week away. They'd loaded them into the car, driven away from the reception with those suitcases in the back seat. And then, at some point between 11 p.m. and dawn, they decided to die. But they'd never unpacked, never taken the suitcases out of the car. Why not? If you're planning to kill yourself, why bring luggage? Why maintain the pretense of a trip you're never going to take? Unless the luggage was part of the plan, part of the misdirection, a way to make their disappearance look like something else, like a beginning instead of an ending, like 2 kids running off to start a new life instead of 2 kids running off to end the one they had. It was brilliant, in a dark way. By packing for a honeymoon, they'd given their families hope, given them something to cling to for 39 years, the possibility that Roy and Linda were out there somewhere, living under new names, starting over, happy. It was a gift, almost. A terrible gift, but a gift nonetheless. Better to wonder than to know, better to hope than to mourn. But the drought had taken that gift away, exposed it for the lie it was, and now the families would have to mourn what they'd been hoping for all along. Sarah thought about Walter Barrows, sitting in his care facility with his polished shoes and his guilt, and the letter pressed against his chest.
He'd spent 39 years wondering if his daughter was alive somewhere. Now he knew she wasn't. Knew she'd been dead since the morning after her wedding. Knew she'd died because of pressure he'd helped create. Pressure he'd insisted on maintaining even when it became clear the cost was too high. Was he responsible? Legally, no. Morally, partially. But responsibility in cases like this was like trying to catch smoke. You could see it, you could smell it, but you couldn't hold it in your hand. It dissipated across too many people. Walter and his pride, the lenders and their terms, the culture that equated love with expense, Roy and Linda and their inability to see any other option. Even Dennis Holmgren, who'd meant well, but whose loan had still contributed to the burden. Everyone was a little bit responsible, which meant no one was fully responsible, which meant there was no one to punish except two people who'd already punished themselves in the most final way possible.
Sarah closed the file, signed the paperwork, marked the case as resolved. But she couldn't shake the feeling that resolved wasn't the same as finished. That understanding what had happened wasn't the same as understanding why it had to happen that way. That knowing the facts wasn't the same as knowing the truth. She decided to visit the lake one last time. Drove out to Lake Overholser on a Tuesday afternoon. The drought was still holding. The water level was still low. The exposed lake bed was still visible, cracked and dry and alien-looking, like the surface of a planet where nothing could grow. Sarah walked down to where the car had been. The tire tracks were gone now, eroded by wind and foot traffic and time. But she could still picture it. The Impala accelerating down the slope, Roy at the wheel, Linda beside him. Both of them knowing what came next, both of them committed. The moment of impact, the cold shock of water, the car sinking, the windows holding.
The doors sealed by pressure, and inside, two people holding hands, waiting, accepting, letting go. How long had they stayed conscious? Minutes, probably. Long enough to second guess? Long enough to regret? Or had they gone quickly, their decision made, their peace achieved? Sarah hoped for the latter, hoped that whatever had driven them to this point had at least granted them a calm ending. But she knew better than to assume peace and drowning. It was violent, painful, terrifying, even when chosen. She stood there for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, watching the shadows lengthen, thinking about all the ways life could break people, all the pressures that seemed manageable from the outside but felt insurmountable from within. All the moments when asking for help felt harder than choosing oblivion. Her phone rang. It was the station. They had a reporter asking questions about the Kane case, wanted to know when they could release the information.
When the public would learn that the missing couple from 1985 hadn't been murdered, hadn't been kidnapped, had simply driven into a lake because debt and expectation had made life feel impossible. Sarah told them to wait. Give the families another day. Let them process before the story became news, before the tragedy became content, before Roy and Linda Kane became a cautionary tale about wedding costs and mental health and the pressures of young adulthood in America. She drove back to Restwood Care Center, went to Walter Barrow's room, found him in the same chair by the same window. He looked smaller than before, as if the knowledge of his daughter's death had compressed him physically, made him less substantial. She told him the case was officially closed, told him the findings, told him what would happen next, the media, the public interest, the questions from strangers. She asked if there was anything he needed, any support she could arrange.
Any way to make the coming weeks easier? Walter shook his head, said he'd been preparing for this moment for 39 years. Hadn't known he was preparing, but apparently he had been. Every day of wondering had been practice for this. Every year of not knowing had been training for the knowing. He was ready as anyone could be.
He asked Sarah one question, just one. He asked if she thought Linda had loved him, despite everything, despite the pressure, despite the debt, despite his pride and his failures and his need to impress people who didn't matter. Did his daughter love him when she died? Sarah looked at the letter, still folded on Walter's side table, still creased from where he'd held it. She picked it up, found the line, read it out loud. "We love you. We're sorry. This is not your fault." She told Walter that yes, his daughter had loved him, even at the end. Even in the moment of choosing death, she'd thought to absolve him, to tell him it wasn't his fault.
Which meant she'd understood that he'd blame himself, which meant she'd known him well enough to predict his guilt, which meant she loved him enough to try to prevent it, even knowing the attempt would fail. Walter nodded, slowly, like a man accepting a verdict. He said that was something, at least. Not much, not enough to balance the scales, but something, a small light in a very dark room. Sarah left him there, drove back to the station, wrote her final report, documented everything, the evidence, the interviews, the timeline, the conclusion. Murder-suicide. 2 victims. No perpetrator. No one to arrest. No one to prosecute. Just a tragedy that had been sleeping at the bottom of a lake for 39 years and had finally woken up because the rain stopped falling and the water went away. The news broke the next day. The story went national within hours.
Missing couple found after 39 years. Wedding rings solve decades-old mystery. Drought reveals tragic end to honeymoon dreams. Every outlet had a different angle. Every headline emphasized something different. But the core story was the same. 2 young people, in love, in debt, in despair, in a lake. The comment sections filled up with opinions. Some people blamed Walter. Some blamed the lenders. Some blamed capitalism. Some blamed mental health stigma. Some blamed Roy and Linda for not trying harder, for not reaching out, for not believing things could get better. Everyone had someone to blame. Everyone had a theory about what should have been done differently. Everyone was an expert on someone else's tragedy. Sarah stopped reading after the first day. Didn't matter what strangers thought. Didn't matter what explanations they constructed or judgments they passed. The people who mattered had their answers. The families had their closure. The case was resolved.
The rest was just noise. Dennis Holmgren called her a week later, said he'd donated the $3,000 plus 39 years of accumulated interest to a nonprofit that helped young couples with wedding debt. Said it wouldn't bring Roy and Linda back, but maybe it would help someone else avoid their fate. Maybe some other couple would accept help that Roy and Linda hadn't known was available, or hadn't believed was real, or had been too proud to accept. Sarah told him it was a good idea, a fitting memorial. Better than a headstone or a plaque, better than anything that just commemorated death without preventing it. She visited the cemetery where Roy and Linda were finally buried, side by side, together, the way they'd wanted. Their families had debated keeping them apart. Some people thought it was wrong to honor a suicide pact, wrong to romanticize what they'd done. But in the end, love had won over judgment. They'd been buried in the same plot, under one headstone.
With their names and dates and one simple phrase, together always. The funeral was small, family only. Sarah wasn't invited, but she went anyway. Stood at a distance, watched people cry for 2 people they'd been mourning for 39 years, but were only now allowed to officially grieve. It was strange, seeing public sadness for private loss, seeing the performance of grief that came with finality. Diane, Roy's sister, spoke. She was 67 now, gray-haired and grandmother-aged. She'd been 18 when her brother disappeared, had spent her entire adult life as the sister of a missing person, and now she was the sister of a dead person, which was somehow both worse and better. Worse because the hope was gone, better because the wondering was over.
She said Roy had been a good brother, protective, kind, always helping with homework or fixing her car or lending her money when she needed it. She said she'd always known something bad had happened.
That Roy wouldn't have just left without saying goodbye. That whatever had taken him away had been bigger than his desire to stay. She said she forgave him. For leaving. For choosing Linda over everyone else. For making a decision that had rippled through 4 decades and left scars on everyone who'd loved him. She forgave him because that's what you did for family, even when they broke your heart. Walter Barrows didn't depend. Too frail, the family said. Too ill. But Sarah suspected it was something else. Suspected he couldn't bear to stand over his daughter's grave, knowing what he knew. Knowing what his pride had cost. Knowing that he'd live another few years or months or weeks, carrying that knowledge like a stone in his chest. She visited him one last time before closing the case permanently. Found him in his room. Same chair, same window, same view of the parking lot and the struggling oak tree. But something had changed. He looked peaceful. Not happy, not content, but peaceful.
Like a man who'd finally stopped fighting something. He told Sarah he'd made arrangements, left instructions. When he died, he wanted to be cremated. Wanted his ashes scattered at Lake Overholzer, at the spot where Linda's car had entered the water. He didn't want a grave, didn't want a headstone, didn't want people visiting him. He just wanted to be where she'd been, in the place where she'd made her final decision. Maybe that way, he said, he could finally understand. Finally see what she'd seen that morning. Finally know why death had seemed preferable to life. Sarah didn't argue, didn't try to talk him out of it. Some decisions were between a person and their ghosts. Some conversations happened in places the living couldn't reach. She closed the file, literally, put all the papers back in the folder, put the folder back in the archives, marked it resolved, moved on to the next case, the next tragedy, the next family waiting for answers. But she kept the image with her. The rings on the dashboard, that strange, careful arrangement. That final message from 2 people who'd chosen each other over everything else, including life itself. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't noble, it was just sad. But it was also, in its own terrible way, true. They'd meant what they said. They'd loved each other enough to die together. And in the end, that's what they'd done. Sunk to the bottom of Lake Overholzer on a July morning in 1985. Held hands while the water rose. Stayed together while the world moved on without them. Waited 39 years to tell their story. The drought ended in November. The rains came back. Lake Overholzer filled again. The lake bed disappeared beneath the water. The tire tracks were erased. The place where the car had sat for nearly 4 decades became just another patch of lake bottom, anonymous, unremarkable, holding no evidence of the tragedy it had witnessed. But Sarah remembered, would always remember. The rings on the dashboard, the letter in the plastic bag, the suitcases that had never been unpacked, the $3,000 that had never been spent, all the pieces of a life that had ended before it had really begun. All the evidence of a decision that had seemed like the only option available to 2 people who couldn't see any other way forward. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, Sarah would think about them, would wonder what she would have done in their place. 23 and 25 years old, in love, in debt, under pressure, sitting in a car in the dark with a pen and paper and a decision to make. Would she have chosen differently? Would she have found help? Would she have believed things could get better? Or would she have looked at her partner and seen the same exhaustion reflected back and decided together that this was the ending they wanted, the only ending that made sense? She didn't know. Hoped she'd never have to know.
Hoped no one would ever have to make that choice, but knew that somewhere, tonight, Someone was sitting in a car with someone they loved, doing the same math Roy and Linda had done, adding up the debts, subtracting the possibilities, dividing the future by the weight of the present, and coming up with an answer that felt inevitable. The case of Roy and Linda Kane was closed, but the questions it raised remained open and would remain open, because tragedy doesn't have solutions, only stories, and sometimes stories are all we get.